Welcome everyone, dear participants. We're happy to see you. My name is Ahmet. I'm the Director of International Programs at the Objectivist Network. And today my guest is Alexander Hammond, who is the founder and director of Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity, which is a project of the legendary liberal think tank, IEA, Institute of Economic Affairs. Alexander often writes about African trade and development. He gives speeches in different platforms, and he is specializing on economic freedom. And today we will discuss with him about the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is an exciting development for the prosperity of the continent. Let's start with the basic questions, Alexander. Why international free trade is good and how it provides a more prosperous society?
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me in the first instance. It's really great to be here and to be talking with you all. Why free trade is important to prosperity. So even if we ignore free trade, let's just think about trade and exchange in itself. I challenge anyone either attending here virtually or listening to this on YouTube later, imagine a world where trade with other people wasn't possible. It was illegal to do so. You'd have to grow everything yourself. You'd have to build your own home, make your own appliances. You wouldn't even be able to trade your labor for an income and have a job. And in short, I think we all know that we'd be pretty poor pretty fast. I'd probably be homeless and very, very hungry. And there have been some examples of people trying to do basic tasks without any trade. A few years ago, an American man tried to make a sandwich from scratch. A chicken sandwich from scratch, I should say. He grew the vegetables himself. He gathered the salt water. He milked a cow, turned the milk into cheese, pickled a cucumber in a jar, collected his own honey, personally killed a chicken. And all in all, it cost him about 6 months of labor and over $1,500, all for a sandwich, which he admitted didn't taste very good. Although in this example, I actually think he cheated because he took an aeroplane to go and get the sea water to get the salt from rather than build his own aeroplane. So that just provides one example of just how basic tasks would be almost impossible without trade. And there's other examples of someone trying to build a toaster all on their own with little expertise in the area, and it took him many, many months and it only lasted 5 seconds before it burst into flames. So that's kind of why trade is so important. And there is a popular notion among some protectionists that a country should strive to be self-sufficient and build everything and trade just internally. But to be honest, no person or indeed no country can become rich in isolation. And to me, national self-sufficiency, meaning very heavy protectionism, makes as much sense as city self-sufficiency or household self-sufficiency. And exchange, providing no coercion is involved, creates wealth because it leaves both parties better off than they were before. Otherwise, why would you trade anything if you don't feel like you're gaining from it? When I go to the shop to get a sandwich, I value that $2 or whatever it costs me less than I do that sandwich I'm getting. So if we establish trade creates value, barriers to trade, we must therefore acknowledge limit the amount of wealth and value that can be created and therefore harms economic growth and society.
Thank you. So what exactly is the African Continental Free Trade Area? And is it something that enables international free trade?
Yes, so the African Continental Free Trade Area is a project of the African Union. And for those who don't know, the African Union is a little bit like the EU. They're trying to model themselves on it just a little bit. They don't have as much power, not nearly as many employees. But I think that's kind of their goal, is to become an EU-like structure in the future. And one of their projects in order to do this is the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, sometimes called AfCFTA. And this project was first launched in March 2018. This is when it was first opened for signatures by the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, who was at the time the African Union president. Very quickly, it gathered a lot of signatures, which means countries signed it, showing their support. And then a lot of nations have now ratified it as well. So it's been about 5 years since it was 5.5 years since it was first introduced. And out of the 55 African Union nations, 46 have ratified it through their parliaments. So it really is quite influential and gathering a lot of steam. All the main economies on the continent are part of it and have been for a number of years now. However, I should note that no trade has actually happened under it just yet. It's still in early stages. A lot of negotiations need to happen, which I'm sure we'll get into, and a lot of kind of fine details need to be sorted. But the main goals of it is, once it's operational and happening, is for in 5 to 10 years, depending on if your country is less developed or more developed, 90% of tariffs between goods traded between African countries will be removed. And then within 13 years, they hope that 97% will be removed, tariffs, that is. It's the largest free trade area by number of countries in the entire world. And I think it's a really exciting development. There are a lot of hurdles it must overcome, but there's also a lot of opportunities. And many organizations, whether it be the Brookings Institution, the World Bank, the IMF, have done various different studies looking at the potential benefits. And I don't want to cite them to you because I think they're quite out of date now. They were maybe made in 2018 and they made a few assumptions that haven't happened yet, but all agree that tens of millions will be lifted from extreme poverty. Billions of dollars will be created, up to $500 billion indeed, from the free trade area within 10 or so years, and inter-African trade to really expand. So that's kind of a bird's eye view of the free trade area and some of its benefits.
You mentioned 46 countries that ratified the agreement. When they are going to start the operations, like why is it still waiting since 2018?
Yeah, that's the really million-dollar question. Why it hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of reasons, quite simply. The infrastructure between African nations in many instances is lacking. And there's a lot of rules that need to be established and agreed upon between member states. For example, rules of origin is one thing that's really holding up the implementation of the agreement. And rules of origin state that goods that are traded under this no tariff zone have to, at least to a certain percentage, be made in Africa. And although kind of objectivists and libertarians might not like this because it's not true free trade, in kind of realpolitik world, it makes sense because they're worried about, imagine Turkey sends loads and loads of goods to Kenya, and then those goods are then traded to Tanzania, tariff-free. They're trying to stop that and just ensuring it's African goods, at least to a certain percentage, that are traded, because otherwise it's not really a continental free trade area, more like a global free trade area that different countries can utilize. And they're not a fan of that. However, why rules of origin is holding things up is because having the technology on every border and the systems in place to know what percentage of what goods are from a specific country, and if everything in that shipment lines up with the paperwork, is quite difficult. And that's one of the major barriers. And then there's also barriers in regards to regulations that they're looking to harmonize, which can get quite tricky quite quickly.
This is one of the things that I'm really curious about, because from an objectivist perspective or from a pro-liberty perspective, the biggest challenge of these kind of free trade agreements is that they can impose new regulations and controls in the name of free trade, which is a very common criticism of many different free trade agreements like this, like AfCFTA. Do you think this agreement, AfCFTA, is successful in providing a framework in which international trade is not restricted by the governments? Like, is it something better, or is it something that can be used or abused by the governments to,
Yeah, that's really
provide this. Can it provide its goals, or is it just?
Yeah, that's a really big question. And there's two dimensions for that. I'll start when we're looking at the state powers and state players involved. So even though this free trade area has been ratified by 46 nations across Africa, many of these nations have no other indication that they're pro-free trade. A great example is Nigeria. when the free trade area was being discussed and ratified by some nations, they were being very hesitant. They said they were never going to, they said it was going to be years and years before they would ratify it. They were really dragging their feet. However, a month before it entered what's known as its operational phase, where kind of negotiations are starting and things are really kicking up, they then suddenly ratified it. And that really begs the question, because Nigeria had its borders closed for many of its neighbors from 2019 to about 2021, with very little reason apart from to try and protect their local industry, they claim. So it is peculiar that when Nigeria ratified a free trade area, considering they don't really implement any free trade policies. And why this is important to think about is because one person could view that and say they did it, they ratified in order to get their feet at the negotiation table, and to have some influence on what goods are excluded from the tariffs, because we mentioned it was 97%. And that's by total number of tariffs rather than trade volume. So there's a lot of things could be manipulated. Maybe they joined because they wanted to water it down over time. So it's not 97%, maybe it will end up being 70, then 50. That's a question, but unfortunately, as it's happening behind closed doors, it's hard to know. But in regards to regulations coming from free trade areas, it's quite a tricky one, because ideally, I think libertarians would agree that mutual recognition would be best. So that, for example, that would be Kenya recognizes that a toaster made in Tanzania is absolutely safe and fine to be used in Kenya. But realistically, that doesn't actually happen. And a good example of this was Europe before the Maastricht Treaty. And now the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 meant hundreds of thousands of regulations came out of Brussels, ironically on, say, the power consumption of toasters, how curvy a banana can be, things like this. And it's very easy to criticize that. And I think many of us will agree that the regulations went a bit overboard. But the reason they did that is to at least make some trade easier. And I say this because before the Maastricht Treaty, and we're just taking this as an example, it'd be impossible to sell a tractor across the EU, because in Belgium, the windscreen had to be a certain thickness. In Portugal, it had to have a different thickness of windows. In Germany, the back to tire ratio was different than it was in France. So trade actually wasn't even happening because of all these different regulations. And as I say, ideally, we just say mutual recognition, everyone accepts a tractor as a tractor, but that just, unfortunately, kind of on a political basis, it never really happens. So therefore, they have to create their own regulations and harmonize these regulations, which does actually help trade. So even there's this definite balance to play for libertarians, because we don't want more regulations to be created. However, at the same time, it will be very difficult to get 55 African countries to mutually recognize everyone else's products. So maybe some regulation is needed to help that. But then I feel uncomfortable saying that more regulation is needed, considering we know it's going to be tens of thousands of different regulations that are quite obscure.
My question has been kind of trying to understand them, but at the end of the day, from an objectivist perspective or from pro-liberty perspective, we love capitalism, and we believe that capitalism is a way to increase the prosperity of the individuals. Do you think that at the end of the day, this agreement is transforming Africa towards free trade and capitalism? And can you provide some concrete examples, maybe, how this agreement is going to change the economic climate in the continent?
Absolutely. So I mentioned before that most estimates seem to indicate tens of millions out of extreme poverty and billions added to the economy over time. But there's a few different examples I think that are worth looking at. One is manufacturing. And now, quite often libertarians, we don't tend to concern ourselves with what different nations are trading with each other, as long as trade's happening. So what's the difference of Kenya trading with Turkey or Kenya trading with Tanzania, its southern neighbor? However, in the case of Africa, what's quite interesting is when African nations trade with each other, they're far more likely to be higher valued manufactured goods, about 3 times more likely. When African states trade with the rest of the world, they're far more likely to be commodities. So if your economy is essentially reliant on commodities, sometimes it can be okay if you've got really good policy infrastructure in place, a pretty stable, strong government, as in strong as in rule of law, property rights, not strong as in large and overburdening. However, in the case that you don't have a stable government or rule of law or property rights, reliance on commodities can really impact your economy. Commodities tend to fluctuate in price quite heavily. And when that happens, economies can go from growing at 10% a year to suddenly declining by 20% a year. And if you're an investor, imagine if we all had $100 million to invest. I think it's all quite clear we'd rather invest in an economy that's growing at a steady rate of, I don't know, 4-5% rather than fluctuating from 10 to -15 to 20 to -40. So it's a simplistic way of putting it, but reliance on commodities can kind of create an unstable business environment. So therefore, through the free trade area, if we can encourage African countries to trade with each other more, or indeed they trade with themselves more, is more likely to be manufactured goods. Manufactured goods is great for a couple of reasons. It can diversify their export markets, so kind of a less reliance on commodities and growing new industries. And in a way, that's how most countries in the world have developed. They've gone from more agrarian commodity reliance to industrialization, and then eventually to the services sector. So increasing this manufacturing trade through little or no tariffs could kind of be a way to kickstart Africa's industrial revolution. So I think that's quite important when we talk about the AfCFTA.
And what does it mean for the individuals who want to trade, who want to, trade value with other individuals, really? Like, is it going to enhance economic freedoms in the countries too, or is it just about, the trade between the countries?
Yeah, so the free trade area itself is just about trade between two countries. This will definitely help small to medium enterprises. In a lot of the countries I work with as part of the IATP, we're focusing on easing up regulations around the border. For example, in some nations in Tanzania, getting an export license, so permission to trade internationally, is very expensive, takes a long time. And our partners there have been working hard to reduce the amount of pages you have to fill out and to streamline the process. That's just one example, but there's a lot of things outside of the AfCFTA that kind of civil society and think tanks are doing on the ground to really make trade easier, especially for smaller enterprises or sole traders and individuals. So the free trade area itself doesn't necessarily look at that, even though they are trying to put a big emphasis on smaller businesses, because that's really the lifeblood of the African economy as a whole. It's not, when Africa is not dominated by large businesses. Most people are employed in small to medium sized businesses. However, the free trade area itself has no actual legislative power. So it can't say to Kenya, you have to reduce the export license, or you have reduce the cost, or reduce the time it takes for anything. It actually has no power to do that. And that's actually another risk of the free trade area as a whole, because we can get to the point where all the tariffs are agreed on, rules of origin are agreed on. And then the AfCFTA can present it to the partners which have ratified it and have signed it, but it actually lacks somewhat of a legal mechanism in order to ensure this trade actually happens. And it's kind of reliant on the state partners itself to enforce it. So that's, I think, where we're at. And it's how a lot of free trade areas start. I mean, same with the EU. You have to rely on the states to do it. And it's pretty, I think it's correct, right? You don't want the African Union to be able to dictate local government policies.
But do you think that this agreement will influence the countries to embrace more capitalist policies?
Yes, that's the hope. The hope is it will have this trickle down domino effect on a variety of barriers to trade within the continent. And I think one of the coolest things about the free trade area is if we take a step back from precise tariff reductions and when trade will actually start to happen, is if we look at the history of kind of ideas in Africa broadly since the end of colonialism, so we're talking around the 1960s, 1970s time for most nations. Back then, the majority of African states adopted what's called African socialism. A lot of the leaders created the Organization of African Unity. And this is the predecessor to the African Union, which is putting forth a free trade area. And the Organization of African Unity was created with the intention of creating a united socialist Africa. They believed socialism was key. They wanted to be very protectionist, not trade with really between themselves much, or the rest of the world. Everything should be government run and really centrally planned, to put bluntly. However, when we fast forward 50 or so years, and then we're looking at the African Union today putting forth the largest free trade area in the world, and 46 nations have ratified it. We've got leaders from across the nation saying that free trade will be the foundation of future African prosperity. I'm paraphrasing the South African president there. And there's really a kind of a groundwell of support for it. So this ideological shift, a lot of people talk about the free trade area and its benefits, and challenges, which is great. But this ideological shift, I think, really should be emphasized, because even if the free trade area fails, it doesn't, some barriers come up or challenges that just can't surpass. It's still fascinating to see how ideological change has happened in the continent, at least publicly. Maybe behind closed doors, there's still many leaders are still passionate socialists, but publicly they're certainly not anymore, and that's quite a cool change, I think.
And you said there is a possibility that it might fail because of some challenges. But if it succeeds, if it reaches all of its goals, can you think of any negative implications regarding the capitalism or free market, or is this something that we really want to happen?
Yes, so I think it would definitely be a net good for capitalism if it was to happen, if it wasn't watered down, if the rules of origins were not too burdensome. A couple of negatives that could happen. First is one of the ideas behind the free trade area is for eventually for there to be a customs union, an African-wide customs union. That is many decades away, in my opinion, if it ever happens. It will be a long time in the future. However, when that point comes, that could potentially be harmful for global free trade, because even though we can hope this customs union, which means Africa as a whole, the African Union as a whole, can go to the United States and get a single trade deal, rather than the United States having to make trade deals with each individual African nation or each current regional economic community. While we hope this African Union customs union would be liberal and open to trade, there is a worry that they just put up the walls and kind of shut everyone out and keep things very internal. Who knows? And I think when it comes to an African-wide customs union, I don't know yet if I would be supportive of it. There are certainly some benefits. It does make trade with the rest of the world easier if they choose to do so. But then, of course, the worry is at that point it could almost turn into an EU as well, an EU-like superstructure as well, where you've got 5 presidents, your own currency, hundreds of thousands of regulations, and your own flag, anthem, things like that. And even though there are certainly some benefits of the EU, we don't want Africa to go in a more protectionist direction. And then secondly, on a more theoretical level, there is a broad concern of trying to implement a high degree of economic freedom before you have any degree of political freedom or political stability. And I think we saw this quite heavily, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Many industries in Russia were broadly privatized, but they weren't privatized really in the right way. They were handed to oligarchs, friends of Putin, and other leaders. So it's highly debated in academic circles, and I still think a lot about it. Having economic freedom before political freedom can lead to some problems, quite fundamentally. And many economists have argued you really need some degree of political freedom first before you then embark on economic liberalization. Because if you embark on economic liberalization, but the government then just captures it and corrupts it, you end up in a worse situation almost than you were before, or a very similar situation. So that's a worry I have.
But the reverse could also happen, like more economic freedom could bring maybe more political freedom with it.
Yeah, of course. That's been my hope. There's a very popular notion, I think, for the first at least decade of this millennia, especially in regards to China, right? That's where people really hoped it would come true, where more economic freedom, and they have become more economically free. They haven't grown because of protectionism. If you look at any ranking of economic freedom, probably most popular is the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World report, which can measure these things. China has become drastically more free, and much richer as a result. However, politically, it hasn't. And there can be debate as to why. Maybe the theory that because initially the idea is if you become freer, you become richer, you've then got this growing middle class that can kind of put a lot of pressure on politicians and the leaders to move in a more free direction. Maybe that assumption was wrong to start with. Or maybe, alternatively, thanks to immense technology that is now available to leaders, this isn't the case anymore. Maybe it was once the case, but now in, say, China, where there's cameras with AI face recognition everywhere, your phones tracking every move, a social credit system, you can have immense control over your citizens, which theoretically could prevent them gaining that political freedom. So it's an interesting idea, and I hope it's true. I hope we can have economic freedom, which results in prosperity, which then puts pressure on the government to change. But I'd just love to see it be proven true in the last decade or two.
Before I ask a more comprehensive question, I want to ask something about the details. So when you look at the official sources, website, or the publications of the African Union, there is a great deal about, abolishment of trade barriers, maybe protected tariffs. It also talks about free movement of goods and services. But will this agreement also bring the free movement of people, as in workers? Because it's not directly mentioned in the let's say, official channels, at least.
Yes, in the official kind of the AfCFTA treaty, as it were, it's not mentioned. However, what's interesting is, I said at the beginning, the free trade area is a project of the African Union. And the free trade area falls under what's called Agenda 2063. And that's it's kind of the African Union's vision of what Africa will look like by the year 2063, so in 40 years. And the three pillars of the Agenda 2063 are the AfCFTA, which we've talked about a lot, a single air market, which is to do with airplanes and easily able to fly over each other's nations. I haven't actually looked at that too closely, but that's broadly what it's about. And then the African Union passport. And this is quite an exciting development. And the idea is quite simply like the European passport. If you have that passport, you can live, work, travel anywhere within Africa. There would certainly be some challenges of this. Of course, they're looking to kind of copy the European passport in this regard. However, one kind of political issue that will inevitably come up is some African countries are a lot richer than others. And I know some European countries are a lot richer than others, but it's certainly not to the same degree. If we look at the differences in income between the richest and the poorest European countries, it will pale in comparison to the difference between the richest African and the poorest African nation. There's some African economies of GDP of $12,000 a year, and there's others which are still in their low hundreds. So huge differences. So I struggle to imagine richer nations accepting this proposal, especially when the richest nations tend to be smaller island nations, just smaller nations in general, like Botswana, Mauritius, Cape Verde. if Botswana's population, for example, is 2 million, and then you've got Nigeria's population, which is well over 200 million, I struggle to see how if Botswana would actually accept free movement of people and labor when you've got such vast numbers of people in other nations. However, what it could at least mean is greater liberalization. Even if it doesn't go to a full African Union passport, it could still mean visas are easier to acquire. Visas for businessmen and women are relaxed, which would be really beneficial. And there are some projects trying to do that, especially in regards to business. So yeah, the passports, they have got a plan for a passport. No real details have come out yet. I believe they're starting to do it with more diplomats and embassy and ambassador officials, and then maybe it will trickle down to the rest of other people or the rest of the populace in time.
This is a very interesting discussion. Before I move on to my next question, I would like to remind the participants, if you have any questions, please type it in the chat. My colleague Özgür is monitoring the chat. They will forward the questions to me. So Alexander, I will ask two questions which are related to each other. So, you know, Ayn Rand said the foreign policy of objectivism is free trade. And in this context, I'm curious, first, is this agreement something that comes from inside Africa? And how is the reactions of the rest of the world, especially the Western world?
Yes, so it has been an African-led project. Of course, it's highly technical, so they have had some support from other foreign delegations, particularly Canadians, for whatever reason. There's a lot of Canadian officials helping support with the paperwork and the various legislation that needs to happen. I was told by someone working at the African Union, when I asked about why there are a lot of Canadians helping support it, he said it's because no one lies in bed at night worrying about the Canadians invading. So there's a few countries kind of like that where they're supporting. It's been largely funded so far, both internally, but the EU has given substantial money, so has the US and so has China. So even though that does mean there's Western and indeed Eastern involvement with China, is still, I think that does show it's fairly non-partisan. You can be China or you could be the United States, but they're still supportive of it, which I think's quite good.
You also mentioned about civil society. I'm curious how civil society is involved in this process. Like, is it something only discussed among the intergovernmental institutions, or is civil society really involved in the process?
Yeah, so I think, to be completely honest, and the AfCFTA won't like me for saying this, I think they want it to seem like a civil society is involved in drafting this and supporting it along the way. But to be honest, I don't think it is. Most of the think tanks I work with are very, very prominent in their nations. However, they have no influence on the AfCFTA. I believe most of them never met anyone who works on the AfCFTA. The only exception to that is our partners in Accra, Ghana, which is where the headquarters is. They are sometimes engaged in events and lunches and meetings and things like that, but I still think it's not at a very deep level. However, what the civil society can be involved in is, as I mentioned before, looking at more domestic policies that hinder trade and helping ease them. And there's a lot of really silly policies to get rid of. Most recently, our partners in Burundi removed, there was a ban on importing fertilizer, staggeringly, importing cement and importing a few foodstuffs as well. And after many reports and meetings and articles and videos, they managed to actually overturn that law. So they can definitely get involved on a more domestic level, a national level, but I haven't seen any actual engagement between them and the AfCFTA headquarters and secretariat itself.
I have a question. Do you think that this agreement could potentially extend to social and political areas and increase stability and peace in the continent? Or is it bound to stay as an economic agreement only?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it does depend on how quickly it will become a customs union. And as I said, I think it's going to take decades and decades to come. But the worry is if it does become a customs union, not only will hundreds of thousands of regulations come out of it as a result, but then may also start incorporating I don't know, environmental goals within trade agreements like the EU now does, which really means trade agreements are no longer about trade. They're about how many trees your country cuts down a year, or what type of fertilizer do you use. And I understand that some fertilizer can be dangerous or whatever, but you get my point. It means trade no longer becomes about trade. It becomes about other things. It can easily divulge into things like, in case of the European Union, how long are your working hours for the employees who are in your country? How much are they paid? Are they paid enough for us to actually accept this trade agreement? It gets into all these social issues which generally hinder trade. And we've seen that with the EU's trade agreement with many South American countries. It's been completely held up because of these debates around environmental and social issues. In regards to peace, there is a lot of academic kind of agreement that more trade does lead to peace. There was a popular phrase, it's not quite true, but it's almost true, that no countries with a McDonald's have gone to war with each other. That was kind of created in the early 2000s. I think it was true at the time, but not true anymore. But it shows a decent idea. Countries that are relatively globalized and integrated into the global economy are much less likely to go to war with each other. And peace is a really important part of, it has to be an important part of Africa's future. And peace also does actually blend into why visa-free travel between African countries might be less realistic, because there are still a lot of terrorist organizations across Africa. Not every nation has them by any means, but we've still got Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia region. So that is a worry, but hopefully, I guess the main idea, to put it simply, is if we can have more free trade, and more free trade leads to greater wealth, that then provides a lot more opportunities, economic opportunities, job opportunities for people. And I believe a lot of violence, especially in regards to terrorism, is as a result of course, there's cultural reasons, but it is a result of lack of opportunities for young men. And kind of one of the phrases is, there's nothing more dangerous in the world than a hopeless young man, a young man with no opportunities. That could lead them to then go into terrorism and join some of these awful groups or armies that are militias across Africa. So that's really the idea behind it. And hopefully a freer, more prosperous Africa will have increased peace, but also then not have trade agreements that descend into being about social or environmental issues and just be about trade.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I have one last question, and this question is both for ourselves, for myself, and for, we are based in Turkey. Objectivist Network is based in Ankara, Turkey, and there are lots of international students here, particularly from Africa, North Africa or sub-Saharan countries. And when they attend our conferences, our seminars, we receive similar questions. So I'm asking it to you directly. What can we do to increase free trade and capitalism in Africa? And I'm not just asking about this agreement, like in general, how can we, as the individuals, as a civil society, how can we contribute to the prosperity of the continent?
Yeah, and it's a really great question. And there's a few different things one could do with their career to do that. First is to kind of go down, as I've discussed a lot in this talk, the think tank route, and to look at, and in many African nations, there isn't a big think tank scene. So there's not many organizations looking at policy and suggesting better alternatives, especially local ones. You often get a lot of international organizations coming over, but they're typically not listened to nearly as much as domestic ones. So that is an idea, joining think tanks and proposing better policies and working towards that goal. And to be honest, I think think tanks globally, if we're looking at the success record over the last 5 years, they've worked best in Africa. I don't think it's a region where it worked better. Even large think tanks in America and Europe, they'd be shouting from rooftops if they had half as much success in changing policy than some of these small African think tanks do. So that's a good route to go down. Business is another great one. Businesses really are the lifeblood of any economy. And if you're able to join a business, and there's nothing dirty about profit, right? Profit is a way that businesses can grow, reinvest, get more employees. And then if you get more employees, it means tens of thousands of people could be lifted from poverty. There's really nothing wrong or dirty at all about going into businesses. Indeed, it's a very moral thing to do. Same with investment. Even working for consultancies, that doesn't seem like it's linked to African prosperity, but if you're working for even an international consultancy, one based in Turkey or Europe or America, that is looking to invest in Africa, and you can give them direction about where to invest in, how to approach the potentially billions that are going to pump into the economy, that is incredibly moral and incredibly good, even though it's not kind of advertised that way initially, and many people don't consider it to be the case. And then going into politics directly, it's a really tough one for me to recommend for anyone in Africa. This isn't the case in all nations at all, but in many African nations, in order to get high up in politics, you have to do some quite dubious things at times and potentially be part of the system. And then by the time you have the power within the system to change it, you might have already been there for 30 years and not be the same person as you were when you went into it. So it is quite hard for me to recommend for someone to go into politics in most African nations, because I think the opportunity to change is very, to change policy by becoming president or what have you, or secretary, is quite low, and it's quite difficult to do so. But I think business, think tanks is great. I know a lot of young Africans are really interested in Africa's fintech sector, especially. I always get asked about the tech sector in Africa. And I think it's a really, really cool industry. It's growing really fast. However, what we should remember, and this is quite theoretical, but it's very important, is developing nations' growth depends on what's called Smithian growth. This is growth from comparative advantage, which means growth that comes from trade and strong property rights and having sound money, so there's no hyperinflation, and lower regulation and lower taxes. They're the things that drive growth in the developing world. So even though Africa's fintech scene is fascinating and very cool and doing a lot of good, it's not going to be the driver of African prosperity, at least for the next 2 or 3 decades. In the future, when many African states are more developed and richer, and their growth relies on innovation, like the economies of Germany relies on innovation, USA, Switzerland, richer nations rely on innovation to grow, poorer nations rely on Smithian growth. So that's what we should remember. And I know a lot of young Africans, and I mention this because so many young Africans are excited by fintech, which is awesome. But just if we are thinking the biggest picture possible, it probably won't be the thing that revolutionizes Africa's economy right now, maybe in the future. And I think there's a great foundation for when African states are more developed for that to really be a global leader, but not quite yet. So I do think think tanks, businesses, investment are, even though they don't seem very sexy and cool from the outside, are really the thing that changes African prosperity and Africa's future.
Yeah, this was inspiring, to be honest. Thank you very much, Alexander, for this insightful discussion. And